So, having said all that, let me then start officially. So, thank you everybody for coming to this ISGS Hong Kong talk. Um, we are extremely privileged today, I think, to have Professor Spencer Kelly with us. He's professor of psychology and neuroscience and co-director of the Center for Language and Brain at Colgate University, New York. He's also been visiting scholar at the University of Washington, also at the Max Planck Institute for Psycholinguistics. And the reason why we're so excited to have him with us today is that he's also the president of the International Society for Gesture Studies and an honorary member of the ISGS Hong Kong. So thank you so much for being with us. For those of you who are not familiar with him, he's got over 50 publications, most of them on gestures. But if you're a little bit afraid of academic publications, you can also find many of his ideas on more popular media, like The Atlantic or the New York Times. And Professor Kelly also has an online course on language and the mind, which of course includes a little bit on gestures too. And in terms of his interest in gestures, he spans the social psychology and also the neural dimensions. But today, I think he's going to tell us about the overlap of all those three dimensions in what is the affective dimension, so emotions, gesture and emotions, an area that has received very little interest from us gesture scholars, and one that certainly does deserve it. So thank you very, very much for agreeing again to talk to us today. And over to you, please. Just quickly to remind everybody, keep your microphones off, and if you have any questions, put them in the chat. So over to you.
Okay, thank you, Renia. Can you hear me okay? Good.
Yep.
All right, excellent. Well, thank you for that nice introduction, and thank you for having me. I am really excited to spread the word of gesture research all around the world, and I'm excited to hear your perspective from Hong Kong and all around the world. So, as Renia said, I'm going to be talking about co-speech gestures in the context of learning and using a foreign language, or sometimes I'll refer to it as a second language. And I want to do that from two perspectives. I want to do that from the traditional perspective, the cognitive perspective, which was really where most of my work, and frankly the work in the whole field, looks at the the informational exchange of ideas, information, perception, these kind of traditional cognitive questions. I want to do that in addition to this relatively understudied emotional framework. And I think that this emotional framework has been understudied recently, but at least historically, it is quite prominently featured. And so I just want to walk you through a short history of the scientific study of gesture. And if you're interested, this is a paper that you can read a more thorough narrative of this. But if you trace the scientific roots of the study of hand gestures, you trace them to perhaps one of the most prominent scientists of all time, and that's of course Charles Darwin. And so over 150 years ago, Darwin wrote this book, The Expression of Emotion of Man and Animals, and he identified hand gestures together with all sorts of bodily actions, facial expressions, body posture, eye gaze, tone of voice, the whole package of bodily communication. And he argued that these bodily actions express crucially important emotional information, and that social sensitivity to that information was really key to our survival as a species, just as is the key to survival of any species, to be able to identify emotional signals. Now, relative to his other work, this book actually kind of languished for about a century, and it wasn't until the mid 1900s, around 1950, that there was a resurgence of interest in this, and that came along with the advent of innovations in video technology, the widespread use of video technology. And starting around the 1950s and certainly through the 60s, 70s, and 80s, a new field coalesced. And that field came to be called what we now refer to as the field of nonverbal behavior. And perhaps the most visible proponent or advocate of this field was Paul Ekman. That's certainly how I got interested in bodily action, was Paul Ekman's work on facial expressions. But if you go back and look at his work, he's talking about all bodily actions, not just face, but hands, tone of voice, much of the same things Darwin talked about. And he made a couple powerful claims. The first claim is that these bodily actions, including hand gestures, were extra linguistic. They were outside of language. Right? That was the first big claim. And the second big claim is that they primarily served a function of communicating, expressing emotional information. Now, it was in that context that in the 1980s, there developed some strong reactions, at least focused particularly on one of those actions, which is hand gesture. And the reactions were by cognitive psychologists and linguists, and most notably, the work of David McNeil in his wonderfully titled Psych Review paper, So You Think Gestures Are Nonverbal. He took aim at Ekman and the whole field's characterization of at least hand gestures. He singled out hand gestures and said, look, hand gestures are anything but extra-linguistic. They are part of language. Together with speech, they mutually constitute language. That was his first move. And his second move was to say, rather than having the primary function of emotional expression, these things are communicating information about thought. So they have a primary cognitive function. And that move really laid the foundation for the entire field of gesture studies, this field, the field that some of you are part of. And really over the next 40 years, our mission as researchers in this area was to prove to the world that gestures have this cognitive function. And I have to say we did a very good job, because now it's well established that indeed hand gestures play an important role in exchange of information and learning and comprehension and perception and all these traditional cognitive functions. However, I think we've done too good of a job, because now we almost have an exclusive focus of the cognitive functions at the expense of this original, at least in terms of scientific study, this original function of emotion. And so what I've been interested in doing in the last really 5-7 years is to try to bring emotion back into the picture and see what it offers us. Why is this an important addition? Now, specifically, today I want to talk about bringing these emotions back into the context of how gesture functions in L2 or second language use and learning. So I'm going to focus for this audience here, because I know a number of you are interested in these sorts of issues. And the framework or the perspective that I really use to motivate some of my questions about emotion, I can trace back to Krashen's affective filter hypothesis. And I know many of you are familiar with this hypothesis, but just briefly, the idea is that you must consider the affective state of the learner if you're going to understand how someone learns or doesn't learn a foreign language. And so things like, the emotional state, the motivational state, how motivated are they? How confident are they? How anxious are they? All these affective things modulate or filter how well the language can kind of take hold into the mind. Now, Krashen didn't talk too much about gesture per se. He did talk a bit about it, but I've used this to generate some questions that I think could be relevant to the study of gesture in these contexts. And one of the big ones is, is it possible that producing gestures as a learner actually increases enjoyment or motivation and makes you more likely to want to stay with a very difficult task, which is to learn a foreign language? That's a question that doesn't get asked too much, but I think it's a real Krashen kind of question. Maybe another question is not directly related to Krashen, more inspired by it, is how might learners use gestures to affectively communicate to native speakers across cultural divides to communicate something about, their level of interest or their confidence or how excited they are to be, interacting with native speakers, that sort of thing. Those are other possible emotional functions of gesture. And I want to talk about both of those functions in the context of three lines of research. And I'll just walk through them one at a time. And I think a good place to start is this study here that explores the role of emblem gestures. And I'll define that for those of you who don't know. Emblem gestures and how they might improve perception, so cognitive perception of L2 speech, and evaluation of someone who's speaking in their non-native language. And so that'll be the first question here that tries to bring these two perspectives together. And so just let me give you a little bit of background on an emblem gesture. So Kendon defines these as visible actions with conventionalized meaning within a culture. And a famous one in American culture is the thumbs up gesture. In many cultures, the thumbs up gesture means good. But not all cultures. There are some cultures in which thumbs up is a grave insult. And that's the interesting thing about these emblems is within a group, there's conventionalized meanings and people understand things to be one thing in one group, but that might not transfer to others. And that'll be a key feature of this study. I've just got a couple of emblems here from a drama. This is a Japanese period piece drama. And there are some gestures here that may be familiar to you, but certainly wouldn't be familiar to an American who's never been to Japan. This gesture here, that gesture actually means okay, or all, this is good, so, everything's good. And that is a gesture that if you didn't know what it meant, you would have maybe the smile might give it away, but you wouldn't know what that meaning is unless you learned the convention. And so what we're interested in is how people could leverage these conventions when communicating cross-culturally to see if they could actually help offset some of the downsides of speaking a non-native language. Specifically, we're interested in one aspect of a non-native language, and that is the accentedness of speaking in your non-native language. Now, this is not news to most of the world, but it is to Americans. The majority of the world is multilingual, and many of those, billions of those individuals, learn their second or third or fourth language later in life. And we know that if you learn a second or third language later in life, it'll be very difficult to speak with a native accent. So many people, billions of people in the world, are speaking a second language with a non-native accent. The problem with that is that there's research, at least in the United States, this work I'm focused on, that suggests that there's a stigma associated with non-native speech. And so some work suggests that non-native accented speakers are trusted less. They're less credible, or teaching evaluations, they're critiqued more in teaching evaluations. There's all sorts of research to suggest that there is this cost to having a non-native accent. And so a simple question that we had is, might gestures lend a hand? It's really hard to change the 200 muscles that are producing your speech. It's hard to change a non-native speech, but it's relatively easy to learn emblem gestures. And that's what we did with this study. We asked, do co-speech emblem gestures affect the perceptual, how well people hear non-native speech, and the social affective evaluation, how they feel about the speaker of non-native speech accents? So this is a study with two experiments. Experiment one was done at Colgate with international students from China who were native Mandarin speakers. And then experiment two, we actually went to Japan. We went outside of Tokyo to Tsuda University to collect data with native Japanese speakers. And so they were our participants. And what we did is we showed them video clips of language learners, Colgate students at various stages of learning, that had them produce speech and had some gestures. I'll show you that in a bit. And then the native speakers were asked to evaluate the speech. What did I hear? How was the accent? And evaluate the learner. How confident was that learner? How nervous were they? Those sorts of questions. So let me give you a concrete here. Here's a Colgate student, an American, and he this is from the Japanese study. He is uttering a very short utterance. These are very short utterances. This one, nomi ni ikanai, means go for a drink. You want to go for a drink. And note that he's uttering it, in this case, with a culturally familiar emblem. This gesture here is the emblem, if you want to say go for a drink in Japan. And we think maybe it's because it's the size of a sake cup, that may be the origin of the emblem. But that would certainly be the familiar way of doing it. Here's a condition in which he's saying the exact same speech, but he's producing an emblem that is not from Japan. This emblem is from Russia. This is a Russian emblem for go for a drink. And there's a fascinating backstory if you're interested in where that gesture came from. Very unfamiliar to Japanese speakers. And then, of course, we had a baseline where the speaker just says the utterance. Now, importantly, the speech was identical. We took the speech from the baseline and then we dubbed it into this. And there are many benefits of naturalistic studies, and I know there's some experts in this call who do naturalistic research in classrooms. But one of the strengths of an experimental paradigm is that you can really eliminate confounding variables. And so what we've done here is eliminated any possible differences in the speech. And so if we see a difference in our conditions, it must be due to the visual, what participants saw. Okay, so that's what we were going for with this control. Yeah, here's an actual stimulus. This is another one from the Japanese study. The speech is kochi desu yo, which means come over here. Whoops, I already revealed my bias, my gesture. You'll see this is actually not the way Japanese people gesture. Here's what it looks like. And I know in many countries in Asia, this is how you say come here. This is how we do it in America. And then here. Okay, that's the baseline. So you could hear it's identical speech. The only thing that differed was the visuals. Whoop. Okay. Okay, I think you get the flavor of that. Okay, so here are our predictions. Relative to speech only, we believe that culturally familiar gestures will improve L2 speech evaluation, make it easier to hear, and positively affect L2 learner evaluation. And then the second prediction is these unfamiliar gestures will do the opposite, okay? So let's go first with these two different measures. The speech evaluation, I'll just share two measures with you. The first one is the most basic. We just asked people, they heard the utterance. By the way, this is within subjects design, but no participants saw the same speaker more than once. So we did all this counterbalancing. I can show you that later. But importantly, it's you only see one speaker in one condition, but it's a within subjects design. So we asked how many, right after they saw a video, just write down what you thought the person said. And people, subjects made mistakes, and they made mistakes differently in our different conditions. And so for the Mandarin participants and the Japanese participants, people made the most mistakes in the speech alone condition. For the Japanese speakers, they made over 4 times as many mistakes in that condition compared to the familiar gesture. Interestingly, the unfamiliar gesture was actually between the speech only and the familiar. We did not expect that. And I can tell you a bit more why I think we found that later. All right, here's a direct question about accent. We asked people after they heard an utterance, rate on a scale from 1 to 10 how accented the speech is. 10 is a perfect native accent, and 1 is a complete non-native accent. So higher means more a native accent. And what we found for the Mandarin speakers is that the familiar gestures produced higher ratings of accentedness compared to our other 2 conditions. And the same pattern, basic pattern for the Japanese speakers. So what this suggests is that these gestures, remember, the speech is identical in these conditions. What this suggests is that at least culturally familiar gestures are making people's accents sound more native. All right, so that's the more cognitive function. Let's talk about this more emotional angle. How do the native speakers feel about these people trying to speak their language? And I'll just focus on 2 measures. One is confidence. How confident is this speaker? High numbers mean more confident, low numbers mean less confident. And you can see for the Mandarin participants, when people did not gesture, they were seen as less confident compared to both of these conditions where there was gesture. And the same pattern we found for Japanese speakers. What about nervousness? How nervous were people? Here we've got the high numbers are more nervous, low numbers are less nervous. The statistics didn't come out as significant here, but we found a very strong effect over here with Japanese speakers, such that there was like a stepwise. The familiar gestures produced the lowest levels of nervousness, unfamiliar next level up, and then speech only was the people were judged to be the most nervous. And so it's interesting, again, that the unfamiliar gestures are actually in between these two, and that was unexpected. And we could talk about that later. So back to the predictions, very clear results for prediction one. Yes, these familiar gestures do improve L2 evaluation, speech evaluation, and positively affect L2 learner evaluation. But these gestures do not, culturally unfamiliar gestures do not decrease this speech evaluation and negatively affect. If anything, they're better than the baseline in some cases. So implications for those of you who are interested in these cross-cultural communications, gesturing can affect many different aspects of how native speakers receive accented speech. It can affect how you cognitively perceive it, but it can also affect how you perceive or evaluate the speaker, all right? There's multiple functions going on here. And these multiple functions are important because at least traditional foreign language instruction, at least in America, and please tell me, you're all from around the world, if things are different from where you're from, please let me know. But traditionally, the vast majority of attention is on speech and hearing and not on gesture and seeing. And I think this suggests that we're missing an opportunity because, as I said, these gestures are easy to learn. And they're easier to learn than a non-native native speech is easy to learn, and so they could be used as a tool in classrooms. And I think that's a missed opportunity for classes that don't focus on these gestures. Okay, let's switch gears. This isn't a linear sequence, and so let me set up each one. We're now switching to a training study where we're trying to get people to hear speech sounds that are difficult for them to process in their, as native speakers of English. We're going to focus on that. And we focus on Japanese in particular. And we're interested in how visual information, gestures, and you'll see some other visual information, may help in a training study, help English speakers hear these really hard phonetic features of Japanese. And so for those of you who don't know about Japanese pitch accent, I'll just briefly walk you through it. Pitch is phonemic in many Japanese words, not all, but many words. You must follow the proper pitch or else you are saying a different word. So here you can see hashi means bridge, but if you do it from these mora, these mora are representing the pattern, hashi, that's chopstick, okay? And what I've just done there is I've given you some multimodal information to help you hear this. One is that these mora are actually written in visually in a kind of metaphoric way to kind of map onto the sound, and then also these gestures. And this is what I mean by multimodal information through the way in which syllables or mora are presented to learners, and also these gestures. So we're interested in how these gestures might affect this learning. And just to give you a little background, for those of you who don't have a background on gesture, this comes, and I've been really influenced by this great work by Kramer and Swearts, this great paper in 2007, where they show that beat gestures, and I'll show you a beat gesture in just a bit, influence L1, so native speakers' speech production and perception of phonetic stress. And so this isn't the example they gave, but this is the one that works for me. So if I were to say, if I want to contrast the word never and that, I can do it like this. I never said that, okay? Or I can say, I never said that, all right? This is a beat gesture, and I did it a little stylized because I'm trying to get in a Zoom screen here. But what they've shown, Kramer and Swearts shown that when you produce a gesture, a beat gesture on a word, you actually enhance the contrast of stress. You boost the fundamental frequency of that word. And so that suggests that these hand gestures might penetrate all the way down into low-level phonemic, segmental processing of an L2. There's some I mean, there's all sorts of evidence that people are recommending that teachers and learners should produce these gestures to help phonetic learning. And these are just a couple of classic studies. Here's some actual classroom studies. And I know some people on this call have done, I'm not listing them all here, but these are just a couple of the ones that have influenced us. These are all very promising, suggesting that, yes, these gestures might be playing a role in the classroom. What we wanted to do was a very controlled experiment to isolate all the variables to see if we could show that these gestures actually are doing what people suggest they're doing. And so here's the question for today. How do different forms of multimodal input affect phonemic perception and self-evaluations in the learner when learning L2 pitch? And so how does that help them hear things better? And then importantly, how do they feel about it? How do they feel about producing these things? And that's where the affective piece comes in. Okay, there's two experiments here. I'll walk you through the general method for experiment 1, but it's the same idea for experiment 2, roughly. It was a training study, and it was a classic pre-post-test design, okay? And there were 3 training conditions. I'll show you those in a bit. And the DV was learning outcome. How well did they do on the post-test? Did they improve from pre to post-test? These were native English speakers, monolingual. They had no experience with Japanese. And this was a between subjects design. The second experiment is going to be a within subjects design, but this is a between subjects design. So we had 22 participants in each condition. And this is a sample of dependent variable, a test item. What we had is a carrier sentence here that was always constant. And then in the box was the target word. And subjects would literally like see this screen. If I were a subject, or you were a subject, you'd see this screen and you'd be told, listen for the word in the middle here and do your best to identify the correct pitch pattern. These are 4 pitch patterns that are possible pitch patterns in Japanese, okay? And so you just had to circle which one this was, all right? So there's no visual cue that helps you hear. You've got to do all your work with your auditory cortex. All right, so that's the pre and the post-test items. And then our training condition, similar sort of training. You know, we had a different carrier sentence, but the target word here now is giving the learner some feedback. And so L refers to a low pitch and H is a high pitch. And so they hear this sentence twice. And then on the third time, they're supposed to reproduce the sentence and do their best to follow the pitch pattern, and they don't hear it, they just have to reproduce it. Okay, so that's our baseline condition. Then we had 2 multimodal conditions. One is what we call the spatial notation, where you could actually see that pattern. So it's not written in these arbitrary L's and H's, but you see that pattern. Okay, you do everything the same as the other condition. And then the third is the most multimodal, where you actually see that pattern and then you produce on the third trial, you trace along with a left-handed gesture. And we chose left hands because we know that the left hand is controlled by the right hemisphere. And there's research that suggests the right hemisphere needs to do a lot of work in order to understand this sort of pitch processing. And so we wanted to, marshal the resources of the right hemisphere. It was a great idea. It turned out to not work, but that was our thinking, at least. In experiment 2, we added a right hand gesture condition. And so I'll come back to this. Everything was the same. It's just this time they could do it with their dominant hand. Okay, those are the training conditions. So let me just present you the data, the learning outcomes from experiment 1. This is kind of a busy slide, so let me just walk you through it. Y-axis are just performance. How well did they do on the tests? And chance was 25%. Okay. There were items that they were trained on. So the pre and post test had items that were directly trained on. And then there were some novel generalization items. And then there's pre-post, and then of course our 3 training conditions. So let me focus first on the novel results, the novel items. We found that 2 out of the 3 conditions improved. We found that the baseline condition did not improve, but the notation and left-hand gesture condition did improve. We also, and by the way, we ran a linear mixed effect model. I can tell you more about that if you're interested in it. We found a 3-way interaction, though, where for trained items, now it was the left-hand gesture condition that did not statistically improve, and these other two conditions did improve. And so this is an interesting finding because it suggests that yes, all training conditions helped people improve, but the baseline and left gesture conditions were less robust, and it was only this notation condition that had the most robust learning. And I'll come back to this, but I'll just plant the seed. It's possible that you can have too little or too much multimodal information, and there's a just right amount, and we nailed it with this the notation condition. So I'll come back to that. Okay, we wanted to follow up on this to see if we could replicate it, and we made a couple changes here. We added the right-hand gesture condition, so there's four levels now. We added, in addition to the kind of the data that I just showed you, their auditory performance, we added some subjective assessments. How did you feel about practicing with these different conditions? And that's the emotional angle. These are a different set of native English speakers. I'll point out this is a within subjects design, and we made this decision because we wanted to have people compare all four conditions within themselves, make subjective evaluations. There's a cost to that, and I can explain what that is after the talk if you want to go further, but that was our reasoning for why we have a within subjects design. So there's no pre-test. They just come in, they do the 4 levels of training, and then there's one test afterwards that tests their ability. And so, here are the 4 training conditions. They come in and they get some different, we do all the counterbalancing, of course. So people see all 4 levels here. And then afterwards, we give them performance on the items in which they were trained in for baseline were different from the items they were trained in for notation. And so these should actually be different items for each condition. But for purposes of illustration, I show it this way. What we found is that there were no significant differences in the post-test. And importantly, these numbers were roughly comparable to the experiment 1, in which we look at performance on the trained items. These are all the trained items from experiment 1. There's no difference. So we didn't replicate the previous experiment. But we did find something interesting in our second set of dependent variables. And so what we did is, after the whole experiment was over, we asked people to reflect on, they did these 4 blocks of training. Which ones did you like better? Which ones were more motivating? All sorts of subjective questions, kind of crash-in type questions. So I'll just focus on a couple of them here. Motivation. Which session made you feel most motivated to continue learning about Japanese pitch accent? We found a non-equal distribution. So chi-square shows this was a non-equal distribution, and it was the biggest difference was between the flat notation, where there was no multimodal information to help you, and the spatial notation. This is the one that produced the most robust learning. So that was the first interesting difference. The commitment to practice. Here's a more direct way to measure motivation. How many hours per week would you practice if you had to try to learn these things? Found an interesting, I ran an ANOVA on this and found an interesting effect where people were only willing to spend about an hour per week for the flat notation, but they were willing to spend over twice as much time on the spatial notation and the right-hand gesture, but not the left-hand gesture. They really didn't like that. Okay, and so this suggests that these 2 conditions are motivating participants. They may enjoy them, and in fact, we actually asked a more direct enjoyment question. Rank them. Here's the 4 items. Just rank them most enjoyable to least enjoyable, and we found a really clear pattern. The flat notation, almost 2/3 of the participants said that's their least favorite. I really don't like that condition, whereas over half are split between liking the spatial notation and the right-hand gesture condition. Most people split between these 2 things, and suggesting that, again, these were there was something about those that, even though they didn't produce any better learning, people liked them better. That's interesting, I think. So let me just tie that up. So again, thinking about the multiple functions. With experiment 1, this is what I said earlier, there might be a just right amount of multimodal input. In the field of gesture studies, there's sometimes a belief that like more is better, more gestures better. I think we need to maybe check that and question whether that's always the case, especially for hard things like these phonemic distinctions. Very hard. You might overload people. You can underload them and overload them, and it may be that just the right amount is just seeing these spatial notations. And when you add a gesture to it, you just distract the auditory cortex from actually doing the work it needs to do. That's not a mainstream view in gesture research, but I think the data, at least from our lab, suggests that in some cases, really for these low-level phonemic type things, I think that we need to be careful about overloading people. But the emotions are different. The emotions are different. Motivation and enjoyment were highest in the spatial notation. Okay, that was the one that was good up here. But this one, which didn't show any differences between the baseline condition, at least in pitch perception, many people said they really liked it. And this suggests that these gestures might be serving a function for learners that go beyond the cognitive function. It might keep people interested. Look, I'm trying to learn Japanese, and it's really hard. And anything that the teacher can do to motivate me and keep me enjoying things is better for my Japanese, because it means I'm not going to bail out and drop the class or stop studying. And so I think this emotional piece, we've been ignoring it in gesture studies, and I think we're missing an important element. Okay, that's really the message of what I'm trying to get across today. So let me try to drive that home in the final study. And again, switching gears a bit, we're switching from Japanese to Mandarin now, and we're switching from perception to production. And I'm going to present you research. This is not a training study. This is not a training study. It just asks speakers, first novice speakers and then intermediate speakers of Mandarin, to speak Mandarin with and without pitch gestures. And then how does that change or influence their speech production, their acoustic features of the speech itself? All right, so it's a little different than what we've done before, but the same idea, the cognitive functions and emotional functions. Okay, look, I don't need to say much about this to this audience, but just for those of you who are coming in internationally, you probably all know that Mandarin has 4 major tones, and I'm not going to play them for you here, but they have distinct pitch patterns. And what we've done in previous research, this is work published 6 years ago, we showed that when speakers produce gestures with these various pitch patterns, it has a modest effect on the pitch production. So let me just walk you through. This is just to set up the work in progress that I want to finish with. This is from the 2018 paper. We had native English speakers, no background in Mandarin. We had a video of a native Mandarin speaker saying 12 words, made up words. Some of them were made up, just 3 syllables here, and then on the 4 tones, so a total of 12 words. And they produced these, and the task, if I were the subject, I'd have to watch what was done on the video and then imitate the speech, and there would be a microphone in front of me, imitate the speech and the actions of the native model. So if there were gestures, I'd have to produce those gestures. This, just want to clarify, this is not a training study, so it wasn't a pre-post or do this and then measure some outcome. This is just looking at when you move your hands and talk, does it change the acoustics of your speech? Okay, that's the question here. And then importantly, this is the first study where I added this emotional angle. Just on a whim, we added this. We asked the question, like, what condition is within subject's design? We asked people, what condition did you like the most? Okay, and it turned out to lead to a really productive line of work. All right, here's what it looked like. So here's the native Mandarin speaker. This is tone 2, rising tone. And she would just say this without producing any special bodily actions. I mean, you could see the face, but there was no emotion. There was just you could see the lips. Here you can see a metaphoric gesture that traces the rise of that tone. And then in this study, we had a head nod condition. Some pedagogical research suggested people teach these tones with head movements. So she would just mimic with her head the metaphoric path of the tones. Okay. And again, you see it's a within subjects design. I see each one of these and I just have to repeat what I see in here into a microphone. And then we analyze the acoustic features. And for this study, we focused on only one feature, the one that had been most previously studied, focused on F0, the pitch of the vowel. And we borrowed a technique from Wang and colleagues where we took the vowel and then we chopped it up into 5 segments and we just took a measurement of F0 at each of these segments. And so this is for tone 1 here. And you can see it's a flat tone. And then we put those F0 scores into a linear mixed effects model with condition by tone by time as our fixed effects and participant trial as random effects. I'm just going to show you the fourth tone because that's the only tone where we found a significant effect for novice speakers. These are total novice speakers here. And we also had, as a comparison, it's useful to take a look at these are native speakers. We actually took international students, Mandarin speakers. Just take a look at the Mandarin. That's what a tone 4 should look like. It really should drag down at time 5. And the mistake that many novices do is they don't go quite as low as they should. And you can see that right here. Interesting, Mandarin speakers, whatever they do with their hands doesn't change their acoustics. They're pros. And so the gestures aren't penetrating down to the acoustics for native speakers. But for L2 speakers, novice, we found an interesting effect. We found that the hand gesture condition dragged down the speech. So saying ma, the hand would actually pull down the speech relative to the speech only and the head nod condition. And that was a significant difference. It wasn't a huge effect, but it was reliable. And so from the study, we concluded there's a modest effect of hand gestures on L2 Mandarin pitch tone production. Here's the interesting angle for the purposes of this talk. At the very end, we had an idea. Let's just ask people. I think someone said that when we piloted, they enjoyed the gesture condition. So we're like, well, let's just see what people like. We were really struck that 19 out of 25 people said that they liked producing the gestures and that it helped the most. They said, like, it helped me say the tone the right way. Now, it didn't really help that much. I mean, there was a modest effect, but it didn't help as much as they thought it did. That was really interesting to us. Again, this dissociation between the perceptual and the emotional, motivational or your subjective evaluations. There's something there. And so what we did is we followed up to really kind of flesh these cognitive and emotional functions out, flesh them out. We made some changes, and I can give you explanations. In the interest of time, I'll just breeze through these. We moved from novice to intermediate learners. We thought maybe there was a floor effect. Let's just take like intermediate learners at Colgate. We thought that maybe the gestures weren't produced big enough, so we have a gesture exaggeration, and then we added in some enthusiasm from our model because that may help with the perception and enjoyment. And so then we measured the standard acoustic properties and then these more emotional, cognitive, emotional, social, emotional affective evaluations. So here's what I mean by it's exaggerated. So I'm not going to stand right now, but our stimulus native speaker was standing. And we borrowed this from Wim Pau's really good work showing that when you're sitting and producing gestures, it doesn't affect the acoustics of speech more than when you're standing. So we thought, all right, we were doing all this sitting in the previous experiment. Let's have the model stand and the learner stand. And so you can see in the gesture condition, standing moves right across the body. And then we added, it's very subtle. I hope you can see that. We added some emotion. So they smiled when they gestured. They did a little encouraging head nods occasionally. And so we just added a little flair of emotion and to see if that would affect our outcomes. So let's talk about the two dependent measures. Here's the standard acoustic properties. And I'm just going to show you tone 3 because it's representative of all the tones. And what you can see here, the model will be in this experiment. How did the native speaker, what does their tone 3 look like? We also superimposed the model from the Chang study. from before. And then we've got our three conditions. There's the speech only, speech plus gesture plus smiling emotion. And you can see two interesting things. First of all, our intermediate language users at Colgate's got some work to do. They're getting there, but they're not dragging they need to drag for tone 3. They really need to drag that down more. Okay, that's the first thing. The second thing is that you can see these lines are on top of one another. Statistically, they are indistinguishable from one another. So it doesn't matter what you're doing with your hands or what if the teacher's smiling or not, it's not changing your acoustics. And it turns out that this is the basic pattern of all of these studies. You can see there are effects where, again, the speakers aren't dragging down as much as they should. But the real interesting thing is that these three conditions are statistically indistinguishable from one another, at least in terms of getting them closer to native speakers. Okay, and there's some subtle differences I can talk about later, but it's not helping them speak Mandarin any better, these gestures. That said, we did find interesting differences with our subjective assessments. And so let's take motivation. This is, again, a classic Krashen type affective variable. What condition made you most motivated? Look, this was not a small effect. The vast majority of people said it was the speech plus gesture plus emotion condition. Remember, so within subject design, so they can compare. That said, I would like, if I'm going to keep learning Mandarin, I want that teacher. Okay, they really that motivated them. Which condition did you enjoy the most? Again, not a small effect. People preferred the speech plus gesture plus emotion condition. Then they liked the gesture condition, and the least preferred was the speech only condition. So again, we have an interesting dissociation. The acoustics are statistically indistinguishable, yet the subjective reflections, affective reflections, are quite different across conditions. So let me conclude this and then wrap it all up, because I'm really curious to hear your questions. There are modest benefits in producing tones when novices mimic a model's gesture, and that's from the 2018 paper. And I'll say there have been other, good studies done out there. Laura Moret's done interesting work, and others have done some work that suggests there are effects at the phonemic level for Mandarin, but it's our belief that these are modest effects, at least compared to the semantic benefits of gesture. Those are not in doubt. But I do think that for these, phonemic, segmental benefits, gesture shows only a modest effect. And we can argue about that if you'd like, but that's at least what we conclude from our line of research. That said, there are not modest effects when it comes to these affective features. Imitating pitch gestures produced by an enthusiastic model is highly motivating and much more enjoyable than just doing speech alone. And this is important for actual people learning. Even if it doesn't help you at the beginning to sound better, or even in the middle to sound better, if it's keeping you in the seat or standing or however you're learning the language, if it's keeping you coming back for more, that's an important function of gesture. That's often overlooked in our field, and I think we do so at risk of not understanding the full picture. So let me just tie together the full picture, general conclusions. Look, this is focused on L2 learning and use, but I think this is a plea to the larger gesture community. Please, can we bring emotion back to gesture research? We have done an excellent job showing gesture plays a role in this cognitive exchange of information, but we also know that gestures are serving other functions. And I think it's important to bring things like facial expressions together with gesture and tone of voice together. We stripped out emotion to try to purely study like gesture purity. And I think we've, stripped out some of the most interesting things that gestures can do. So I think we need to bring emotion back to gesture research. And I think this has real practical implications for those of you I know who are wanting to teach, for example, English as a second language in China. You would benefit from thinking about the whole learner approach. So Krashen, one of his great contributions was to say, we've got to consider all dimensions, not just the information exchange, but we have to consider the motivational state, the affective state of the learner. And we have to target each one of those things if we're going to lead to the most successful, learning outcomes, which is mastery of a second or third language. So I think this definitely has practical implications. Okay, before we take questions, I just want to acknowledge this fantastic group of students. I don't know, those of you might not know, Colgate is an undergraduate institution. We don't have graduate students, and we do all of our work with students doing research assistants and senior theses, and we have such a debt to them. They're fantastic, and I just Yukari and I wanted to make sure that we thank them. And this, for those of you who don't know, is my collaborator, Yukari Harata, and we are very appreciative of Colgate's generous funding to allow all this research to happen. Okay, so with that, I'll finish up and I'll just ask you if you have any questions.